Welcome back to the Morning Kickoff Show. I'm your host, Matt Witt. Today we are here to talk about who is the Minnesota Vikings GOAT, or greatest of all time. Now, I asked my YouTube channel a week ago who the Vikings GOAT is, and to the surprise of nobody, Randy Moss is the overwhelming favorite with 61%. I believe Randy Moss is the most talented Viking of all time. But does that make you the greatest Viking of all time? We're going to get into that in a little bit. So Randy Moss took 61% of the vote. Second place was Adrian Peterson with 18%. Fran Tarkenton and Bud Grant combined for 18%. And then other combined for 3%. And some of the options in the other people said Alan Page a couple times. We had John Randall and then Justin Jefferson as well. I hope Justin Jefferson goes down as the Vikings GOAT. After 2 seasons, we haven't even seen him play in the playoffs, so we can't say that quite yet. But as for the other two, Alan Page and John Randall, greatest undrafted player of all time, period. And then Alan Page is obviously, if I had another option here, I would have put Alan Page. Now, with that being said, this aside, does Randy Moss get the GOAT title for the Vikings just because of his talent? I mean, he is arguably, in my opinion, he's the best red zone threat of all time. No, best touchdown threat of all time. Let's not say red zone threat. Best touchdown threat of all time was Randy Moss. And a top 3 receiver of all time. You can even argue over Jerry Rice if you wanted to. The man was an absolute monster. But with that being said, did he accomplish what these other players accomplished? It all comes down to really what you value. Because here, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, I want to say everyone's entitled to their own opinion. You can think Randy Moss is the GOAT. That's fine. I personally believe that what you achieved with the Vikings is more important than your talent. And we're going to take a deep dive into it. I just want to say before I get into this, a lot of this is my opinion, and you can argue any of these players other than, I think Justin Jefferson is a little bit of a reach, and John Randall is also as well. But still, Alan Page is still a great option on top of that. We're going to first get into Randy Moss because he got 61% of the votes. Randy Moss played 7 seasons with the Vikings. I know he came back for a little bit, but we're only talking about the 7 seasons right here. That would be the 98 season where the Vikings were the best team to ever not make a Super Bowl, and then the 2004 season. So like I said, Randy Moss was the best touchdown threat of all time. 17 touchdowns his rookie season. Are you kidding me? That was the 98 Viking season where he was a first-team All-Pro, the best player on the best team to ever not make a Super Bowl. The Vikings finished 15-1 his rookie season, and yet they didn't make a Super Bowl, to typical Minnesota Vikings fashion, where they missed a field goal on when you have the best kicker in the league. So we all know, I don't have to go into that. We all know what happened with that team, and I believe if the Vikings won a Super Bowl that year, obviously we're going to give the GOAT title to Randy Moss. But they never made a Super Bowl with Randy Moss. Yes, it's not Randy Moss's fault. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is I value achievements for the team more than I would value their talent on the field. And this is my opinion. Like I said, you can argue whatever you'd like. But through his 7 seasons he was with the team, he had 3 first-team All-Pros. He never did get an Offensive Player of the Year or an MVP or ever even appeared in a Super Bowl, like I mentioned. But he was the best player on the Vikings roster in 98, where they finished 15-1, and that's saying something because that was the best roster in Vikings history. So all talent to Randy Moss, all respect to Randy Moss. Obviously, I believe he's the best touchdown threat and top 3 receiver of all time. And he also averaged over 1,300 receiving yards with the Vikings. So I don't have to make a statement on why Randy Moss was great. Obviously, everyone knows how talented of a player this guy was. And he was such a likable guy. And still, I don't know why we haven't retired his jersey. Why do we have I feel like it's disrespectful to Randy Moss to let Irv Smith Jr. wear his jersey. Why have we not retired 84 at this point? Still, that aside, we're going to put that there. Randy Moss, most talented Viking of all time. But is he the Vikings GOAT? It all comes down to what you value. Next up, we're going to talk about Adrian Peterson. I believe if you compare the two, Adrian Peterson, although I don't believe he was as talented as Randy Moss, he actually accomplished more than Randy Moss when he was with the team. Adrian Peterson spent 9 seasons with the Vikings, where he had 4 first-team All-Pros, more than Randy Moss when he was with the Vikings, 7 Pro Bowls, more than Randy Moss when he was with the Vikings, an MVP, an Offensive Player of the Year, obviously more than Randy Moss, but still, like I mentioned with Randy Moss, never appeared in a Super Bowl. And this is so important for the Vikings because I believe accomplishments are everything when you're looking at the GOAT for your franchise. Both of these teams did make it to an NFC Championship game, but like we all know, it came down to a missed kick in both of the games, I believe it was, in the 2009 Viking season and the 98 Viking seasons, where Adrian Peterson and Randy Moss were both arguably the best players on the entire roster. Still, with Adrian Peterson and Randy Moss, these are the two most talented, skilled positions players in Vikings history, in my opinion. But now we're going to go on to the next ones. Because like I mentioned, Randy Moss was 61%, was nothing of a surprise at all. Adrian Peterson being the second place with 18%, still not that much of a surprise. But it's almost like we are paying no respect to the only dynasty in Vikings history. Can you consider them a dynasty if they never won a Super Bowl? I think so. Because it's still the best dynasty in Vikings history when you're looking at just the fact that they made 4 Super Bowls. The only 4 Super Bowls in Vikings history. Taking a look at Bud Grant and Fran Tarkenton. Bud Grant, hands down, no question, nobody can argue otherwise, is the best head coach in Vikings history and one of the best head coaches of all time. Making 4 Super Bowls in 69, in 73, 74, and 76. Obviously, we all know he lost all of those Super Bowls, but that aside, he did what Randy Moss and Adrian Peterson didn't. And that's make it to a Super Bowl, win an NFC championship game. And why did they make 4? Why was Adrian Peterson and Randy Moss only in 1 NFC championship game? Because it all comes down to head coach and quarterback relationship. Head coach and quarterback is what build dynasties. And this is why the Vikings, you have to pay respect to head coaches and quarterback, because it's the 2 most important spots in an entire franchise. You can change anything you want. You can change the entire roster around that quarterback. But if you keep that quarterback and that head coach, you're going to stay great. Look at the difference between Tom Brady's first Super Bowl and his last Super Bowl. Not his last Super Bowl with the Patriots. It was an entirely different roster. Nobody was the same on the roster. Yet they were still great. It all comes down to the head coach and quarterback, and that is how you build dynasties. So I would actually give the GOAT title to Bud Grant, because obviously he was the one who made 4 Super Bowl appearances. Fran Tarkenton wasn't in the 69 Super Bowl, but he was still in the other ones. On top of that, Bud Grant did have 10 division titles in 11 years. That is ridiculous. A lot of people say Bud Grant never won it all in Minnesota. I mean, they're actually wrong. A lot of people forget, before Bud Grant was the Vikings head coach, he played for the Minneapolis Lakers and won a championship with them. So anybody who says, won the finals championship with them, anybody who says that he didn't ever win a championship in Minnesota is actually lying, because he did, which was incredible for him to go from a basketball player to an NFL head coach, which is not seen very often. Now, I just want to mention here, I would give all the credit to Bud Grant, because he put together a stacked roster, and this is the best. This is the Vikings prime, and you can't argue otherwise. I understand the 98 Vikings was the best Vikings team of all time. I understand the 2009 Vikings was maybe the best in the league at that time. That's when I fell in love with football. That might have been the best team in that season, and yet they didn't make a Super Bowl. But the 69 to 76 Vikings rosters was filled with Hall of Famers. With not only Fran Tarkenton, who we went over, but we have obviously Alan Page, who we also talked about, Carl Eller, Paul Krause, Mike Tingelhoff, RIP, shouldn't have died this soon, Ron Yeri, and Chuck Foreman and Jim Marshall will also be in the Hall of Fame as well. That is about 10 Hall of Famers on the same roster through 69 and 76, where they made championships. You can't say the same about any other 10-year span for the Vikings in history. And for that reason, I personally would give the GOAT title to Bud Grant, because he was able to turn multiple careers into Hall of Fame careers throughout the 60s, late 60s, and throughout the 70s. And I would have to give the GOAT title to to Bud Grant for that reason. Now, you can argue Randy Moss, fine. You can argue Adrian Peterson, still respectable. At the end of the day, you cannot argue against Bud Grant's accomplishments with the team and say that there is another accomplished player in the Vikings. And for that reason, I would give it to Bud Grant and not to the other players. Like I said, it comes down to, what do you value? Do you value talent, or do you value accomplishments? Personally, I value accomplishments. If you value talent, that's fine. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. I'm just stating my case on why Bud Grant is the greatest of all time for the Minnesota Vikings. Thank you.